In the spring of 1525, 4 years after the city of Tenochtitlan had fallen, Spanish soldiers were still burning fields in the Valley of Mexico. They were not burning maize fields. Maize they wanted. Maize they understood. Maize fed their horses and their garrisons and their slowly expanding tax rolls. They were burning something else, red-stalked grain that the locals called Huautli. It grew almost 2 meters high. It carried seed heads, the color of dried blood. And the punishment, written into colonial law, for any village caught hiding it from the inspectors, was to have the offender's hands cut off at the wrist. Think about that for a moment. The Spanish had just conquered an empire. They had melted gold by the ton. They had baptized hundreds of thousands of new subjects. And 4 years on, they were still spending soldiers and seasons and ink to make sure one specific cereal crop disappeared. Not because it was poisonous, not because it was scarce, because in their judgment, it was too good. It fed too many people. It carried too much spiritual meaning. And once it was gone, really gone, gone from the markets and gone from the prayers and gone from the muscle memory of the women who used to grind it, the Mexico world that had grown up around it could not come back. There is a manuscript in the General Archive of the Indies in Seville, dated 1577, that records the standard punishment for cultivating prohibited plants in the Viceroyalty of New Spain. The document is dry and bureaucratic. It lists the crime in one column, the penalty in the next. For repeat offenders growing Huautli or other ritual grains, the entry reads, flogging, confiscation of land, and removal of the right hand. The same punishment, in the same handwriting, appears for theft of cattle and for blasphemy. The colonial state was, in its own internal accounting, treating the cultivation of an indigenous cereal as a property crime against God and the king. That is the tone you have to keep in mind. When we talk about a crop being banned, we do not mean that an academic somewhere wrote a disapproving article about it. We mean that a man with a sword could come to your village, find the plant in your barn, and take your hand for it. That is the altitude at which this story is set. This is an entry from the Codex about the 7 crops that empire after empire has tried to erase. 7 plants the Aztecs grew that fed cities of 200,000 people on water lifted by hand and on soil scooped from a lakebed. 7 crops more nutritious, more drought-tolerant, and on a per-acre basis, more productive than the wheat and corn and soybeans that replaced them. 7 crops that the Spanish banned with the sword in 1521, and that modern industrial agriculture refuses to plant in 2026 for reasons you will recognize the moment you hear them. By the end of this entry, you will know each crop by name. You will know what it does to soil, to a body, and to a balance sheet. And you will understand why 2 empires, 400 years apart, have made the same choice about the same plants. The Codex is open. We start at the burning field. To make sense of why these crops were erased, you have to understand what the Spanish actually walked into. When Cortés crossed the causeway into Tenochtitlan in November of 1519, the city he saw was, by any reasonable count, the largest in the Western Hemisphere, and possibly the cleanest in the world. 200,000 people. Aqueducts of split cedar carrying drinking water from springs at Chapultepec. A market at Tlatelolco that, by his own letters back to the king, traded more goods on a single day than the city of Seville did in a month. And underneath all of it, feeding it, watering it, taxing it. A food system more sophisticated than anything the Spanish had ever encountered. The base of that food system was not a single crop. It was a portfolio. Maize was the workhorse, yes. Beans were there. Squash was there. The famous three sisters that school children learn about. But the portfolio went deeper. It carried a high-protein pseudo-cereal that had no European equivalent. It carried an oil-rich seed that ancient runners chewed on the road. It carried a microalgae harvested from a salt lake. It carried legumes that grew where European beans simply died from thirst. It carried medicinal fruits, drought-proof cactus pads, and fermented greens. Every Mexica family ate from this portfolio. The poor ate from it because it was abundant. The priests ate from it because it was sacred. The army ate from it because soldiers on a 5-day march needed something denser than tortillas, and the empire stockpiled from it because a tribute system that pulled grain from wheat, pork, wine, olives, sugar, cattle on open range. The crops they brought were the crops of monoculture and tax farming. They liked them because they could see them, count them, tithe them, ship them. The Mexica portfolio was the opposite. It was layered, regional, ritualized, and grown in dense polyculture, on land the Spanish could not even map without help. So the choice was not really agricultural, it was administrative. The colonial state could collect taxes on wheat. It could not collect taxes on 1,000 household plots, growing 12 crops between them. The crops that could be standardized lived. The crops that could not were burned, banned, mocked from the pulpit, or quietly let die. We are about to look at the 7 that lost the hardest, and the first one we are going to meet is the one the Spanish hated most: Huautli, Amaranth, the grain whose name still appears in colonial court records as a thing forbidden under threat of mutilation. To understand why a Catholic empire took such an extreme position on a cereal, you have to understand what the Mexica did with it. Amaranth is a flowering plant of the genus Amaranthus, and the Mexica grew at least 3 species of it across the Valley of Mexico. Visually, it is striking. A tall, leafy stalk, topped with dense, drooping flower heads that turn a deep red or gold as the seed ripens. A single plant can produce up to 100,000 seeds. The seeds are tiny, about the size of a poppy seed, but each one is a near-perfect package of nutrition. Amaranth seed runs roughly 15% protein by weight, and unlike maize or wheat, that protein is complete. It contains lysine, the amino acid that staple cereals usually lack. Combine amaranth with beans, the way the Mexica did, and you have a protein profile equivalent to dairy or meat, on land that needs no irrigation and tolerates poor soil. For a civilization without large herds of livestock, this single crop was the difference between a calorically adequate diet and a nutritionally adequate one. The leaves, eaten as a green, added iron, calcium, and vitamins. The seed, popped or ground, became flour, porridge, gruel. Annual production at the height of the empire is estimated at around 20,000 tons. To put that in perspective, that is roughly the modern wheat output of a small Italian province. Produced without plows, without draft animals, without iron tools. That alone would have made amaranth a major crop. What sealed its fate was the second use. The Mexica took amaranth flour, mixed it with honey from the stingless bees of the lowlands, and during certain festivals, with sacrificial blood. They called the resulting paste Izoali. They sculpted Huautli into the shape of their gods. Most often, Huauzontle, the patron deity of Tenochtitlan and the god of the sun and of war. The figures were paraded through the city. They were prayed over. They were broken into pieces, and the pieces were eaten by the worshippers in a ritual where the body of the god became the body of the community. To a Spanish friar in 1524, that ceremony was not a curiosity. It was a horror. It was a parody of the Eucharist, the Catholic rite where bread becomes the body of Christ. Performed in honor of a god the friars considered a demon. The parallel was too close to be tolerated, so when colonial religious authorities sat down to design the campaign of evangelization, Amaranth went on the list. Huautli was outlawed. The use of Huautli in any ceremonial context was outlawed. Through edicts and through quiet pressure on local growers, the crop itself was pushed out. By the end of the 16th century, Amaranth had collapsed from a major staple to a relic crop, surviving only in remote mountain villages where the inspectors could not be bothered to climb. It stayed there for 400 years. Now look at what we lost: a complete protein grain, drought-tolerant, tolerant of poor soil, productive on rainwater alone in regions where wheat fails, edible leaves and edible seed, storable for years if kept dry. In laboratory analysis today, NASA has flagged as a candidate crop for long-duration spaceflight because it grows fast in low-light conditions and recycles efficiently. We grew 20,000 tons of it a year, and we burned it because of what its dough looked like during a Tuesday afternoon religious procession. There is a small revival now. There is a village called Santiago Tuliahualco on the southern edge of Mexico City, where for almost 5 centuries, a small community of growers kept the seed alive, passed it from mother to daughter, and planted it on plots too small and too remote for the colonial inspectors to bother visiting, processed it in family kitchens, sold the candies at the village fair every February. They never stopped. Through the colonial period, through Mexican independence, through the Revolution, through the agrarian reform, through 1987 when a peasant cooperative finally registered the crop and began commercial production. Today, Tuliahualco is the center of a slow and stubborn amaranth revival. Mexican farmers in Tuliahualco and nearby Tlaxcala are planting Huautli again, mostly for traditional candies called alegrias. Popped amaranth bound in honey, the same paste, minus the religion. Health food brands in the United States and Europe have started selling it as a gluten-free ancient grain. But the global tonnage is a fraction of what it once was. A grain that fed an empire is now a niche health product. And here is the question that should bother you. If amaranth is so good, and modern nutritional science is unanimous that it is, why is it not in your supermarket cereal aisle? Why is it not subsidized the way maize is subsidized, planted the way soy is planted, traded on commodity exchanges the way wheat is traded? Hold that question. We are going to come back to it, because the same answer applies to all 6 of the crops you are about to meet. Starting with the one the Mexica gave their long-distance runners, and that you have probably already eaten this week without knowing where it came from. Chian, in Spanish, Chia, Exactly. What is on the side of every health food smoothie bowl since about 2010? Salvia hispanica, the runner seed of the Mexica Empire. The plant itself is a relative of common garden sage, growing waist-high with whorls of small purple flowers. The seeds are tiny, hard, mottled black and gray, and they carry a property that almost no other seed in the food world has. Soak chia seed in water for 15 minutes, and it produces a clear gel that can hold up to 12 times its own weight in liquid. That property is the entire reason it became central to Mexica logistics, a messenger or a foot courier. And the empire ran on couriers since there were no horses. Could carry a small leather pouch of chia seed and a gourd of water on a 5-day journey. Eat a tablespoon a day and arrive at the destination both hydrated and fed. The gel slows water release in the stomach. The seed itself is around 20% protein, 30% fat, and crucially, that fat is mostly alpha-linolenic acid, the omega-3 fatty acid that the modern Western diet is famously deficient in. The Mexica understood the calorie density and the hydration trick long before any of these terms existed in any language. They paid tribute in Chia. The Codex Mendoza, the colonial era manuscript that records the tribute owed to Tenochtitlan by its subject provinces, lists chia by the binload, alongside maize and beans. It was used as a base for atole, a thick, warm drink. It was pressed for oil that was used in body paint and in the coloration of textiles. The seed was so valued that the Spanish colonial authorities, watching the crop go to ritual use as well as to food, banned it for a time alongside Amaranth. Then it slipped through the cracks. Unlike Huautli, Chian had no equivalent of tzoali, no obvious ceremony that mapped onto the Eucharist. It was used in offerings, but offerings of seed are quieter than offerings of God figurines. The crop survived in scattered villages in Jalisco, Puebla, and Guatemala. For 4 centuries, it sat in obscurity, a regional curiosity, sold at market stalls under a name that most North Americans associated, if at all, with a children's novelty toy from the 1970s. Then in the early 2000s, a wave of nutritional research rediscovered it. The protein content, the omega-3 content, the fiber content, about 34% by weight, almost twice that of flax. The mineral profile, calcium, magnesium, iron, zinc. The blood sugar effect, chia gel, eaten with a meal, slows glucose absorption and flattens the post-meal blood sugar spike. By 2010, chia had been rebranded as a superfood. By 2015, global production had jumped from a few hundred tons to over 100,000. The price quintupled. Most of the new growing was contracted out of Mexico to industrial-scale farms in Bolivia, Paraguay, and Argentina, where the supply chain was simpler and the cost was lower. The descendants of the people who originally domesticated the seed received almost none of that revenue. This is the pattern you should start watching for. The crop did not vanish entirely. It survived in the ritual margins. Then, when its value became visible to the global market, it was extracted, not from the original growers, but from new monoculture plantations far away. The Mexica gave the world chia. The world took it, scaled it, and forgot the giver. And here is something even sharper. Industrial chia is grown almost entirely as monoculture. It is harvested by combine. It is treated with herbicide. It is, in other words, exactly the kind of crop the Mexica deliberately did not grow. They polycultured chia between rows of maize and squash. They harvested it by hand, They saved seed from the strongest plants and replanted the next year. The plant we are now sold as an ancient superfood is grown using none of the agricultural intelligence that made it one in the first place. And the result, predictably, is that the omega-3 content of commercial chia varies by a factor of 2 depending on where it was grown and what the soil looked like. There is a study published in 2020 by researchers at the Autonomous University of Chihuahua comparing chia samples from traditional Mexican smallholders to commercial samples from industrial Bolivian and Paraguayan plantations. Same species, same seed line originally. The traditional samples carried, on average, 34% more alpha-linolenic acid and significantly higher polyphenol content. The commercial samples were not bad, they were just thinner. They were what the soil and the breeding had given them. The traditional samples were what generations of polyculture and saved seed had given them. The seed itself remembers how it was grown, and when the system that grew, it is replaced with a different system, the seed slowly, generation by generation, forgets the Mexica Chia, the supermarket Chia. Same seed, different food. Hold that gap in your head. We are going to see it again, with a green you have probably never even seen on a menu. Huauzontle, Aztec broccoli. A name almost no English speaker has ever pronounced, attached to a plant that, by any rigorous measure of nutrition per gram, is one of the most powerful food crops humans have ever domesticated. Botanically, Huauzontle is Chenopodium nutelliae, a close relative of quinoa and of common pigweed. It is a tall, branching plant that produces, instead of large florets, dense clusters of small green flower buds. Those buds are the part you eat. The Mexica ate them roasted, fried, in stews, dipped in egg batter, and pan-fried in a preparation that survives today in Central Mexican cooking as Huauzontles capeados. The leaves are also edible, eaten as a stewed green similar to spinach. The seed is a pseudo-cereal, like its cousin quinoa, and was historically ground into flour. Now look at the nutrition. Huauzontle is, gram for gram, denser in calcium than milk. It carries more iron than spinach. It is high in vitamin A, riboflavin, vitamin C, and protein in the 8 to 10% range. For a green vegetable, that is exceptional. Recent peer-reviewed work has shown that fermenting Huauzontle with specific lactic acid bacteria increases its antioxidant capacity by about 145%. Fermented Huauzontle has roughly 2.5 times the antioxidant load of the fresh plant. Other studies have demonstrated activity against Helicobacter pylori, the bacterium that causes most stomach ulcers. There is preliminary work suggesting anti-inflammatory and even mood-stabilizing effects in animal models. None of this would have been measurable in the 16th century. None of it changes what the Mexica already knew empirically, that this was a plant that kept their families well. So what happened to it? It did not get banned outright the way Amaranth did. The Spanish did not see in Huauzontle the same theological provocation. What happened was quieter and arguably more lethal. The crop required a particular kind of agriculture. The Chinampa system, intensive, hand-tended, polycultured. It required a labor force that knew how to grow and prepare it. As the Spanish broke up indigenous land tenure, redirected labor into wheat fields and silver mines, and replaced communal markets with colonial commodity exchanges, the crop simply ran out of ecosystem. It survived, like Chia, in pockets. Today, Huauzontle is sold in markets in central Mexico, Tlaxcala, Puebla, and parts of Mexico City. Outside of Mexico, you will not find it. There is no global trade. There's no industrial cultivation. The seed is held by indigenous and small-scale growers, traded informally, and not on any major commodity database. Think about what that means. We have a green vegetable with documented nutritional density above spinach, anti-ulcer activity, an enormous antioxidant capacity when fermented, and we are not growing it at scale. Why? Because the original seed bank is small. Because the harvest is labor-intensive. The buds have to be picked at exactly the right window. Because there is no marketing campaign. Because nobody trades the seed on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. Because the global food system is set up to scale things that are easy to handle in containers, and Huauzontle is not. So a crop that could meaningfully improve the diet of hundreds of millions of people sits, mostly, in farmers' markets within driving distance of Mexico City. And here is the thing that should trouble you. We have the data. The nutrition is published, peer-reviewed, freely available. There is no scientific objection to scaling Huauzontle. The objection is entirely structural. It is about supply chains and seed patents and commodity exchanges and the fact that no agribusiness can capture margin on a crop that small farmers can grow themselves with saved seed. The crop has been suppressed not by religion this time, but by economics. Different empire. Same outcome. And before we move on to the next crop, here is the open loop. We have not yet seen the system that grew all these plants together. The Chinampa. The floating gardens. The thing that turned a salt lake into the most productive farmland on the planet at 1500. Before we look at the next 4 crops, you have to see how they were grown. Because the system is half the story. And without it, none of these plants, including the ones still growing in your spice rack, would exist. The Chinampa, the floating garden. The phrase you may have heard in a primary school textbook, illustrated as a kind of woven raft drifting around a lake, picturesque and impractical. That illustration is wrong on every important detail. The Chinampa was not a raft. It did not float. And it was, by yield per acre, the most productive piece of pre-modern agricultural engineering that humans have ever built. Here is what it actually was. In the shallow southern arms of Lake Texcoco, the Mexica drove rows of stakes into the lake bed in long rectangular patterns, roughly 6 to 10 meters wide and 100 to 200 meters long. Inside those rectangles, they piled lake mud, decomposing aquatic vegetation, and household compost, building up a dense black soil bed that rose just above the water level. The narrow channels between the rectangles became canals, used for transport, for drainage, for fishing, and for slow irrigation. Trees, often willow, were planted at the edges. Their roots grew through the bed and anchored the entire structure. Once the willow took, the Chinampa was permanent. It did not float. It was a raised bed, suspended in a lake, glued in place by living roots. The genius of the system is in the water cycle. The lake water seeps laterally into the Chinampa bed. The plants pull water as they need it. Excess water drains back into the canal. The bed never floods. The bed never dries out. There is no irrigation labor at all. The lake does the work. And the lake itself, fed by mountain runoff and by the human waste of 200,000 people, is rich in nutrients. The mud at the bottom of the canal is, periodically, dredged up by hand and added back to the bed, so the soil is constantly being renewed. There is no fallow period. There is no soil exhaustion. The same square meter of Chinampa can produce 4 to 7 harvests a year. Now compare that to modern industrial agriculture. A wheat field in Kansas yields 1 harvest a year. A cornfield in Iowa, on irrigation, yields 1 harvest a year. Soybeans yield 1. The Chinampa yielded up to 7. On a per-acre basis, the productivity numbers are not even close. Modern researchers, including teams from UNESCO and from the National Autonomous University of Mexico, have measured surviving Chinampas in Xochimilco, a small fraction of the original system that managed to survive into the 20th century, and recorded yields of around 100 kilograms of broccoli per day from 7,000 square meters of bed. Extrapolated to a hectare, that is staggering. And that is just one crop. The Mexica grew on Chinampas in dense polyculture, maize and beans together, squash, tomatoes, chilies, amaranth, Chia, Huauzontle, herbs, flowers, every layer of the food system stacked on the same bed. There is one more detail about the Chinampa system that almost nobody outside the agricultural research literature talks about: the microclimate. A working Chinampa zone is not just a field. It is a network of canals, plant beds, willow trees, and shallow open water. And the combination produces a microclimate measurably different from the surrounding region. The water buffer's temperature. Frost is rarer because the canals release heat overnight. Humidity stays higher in dry seasons. Pollinators thrive in the willow strips and the flowering edges of the beds. Pest pressure is lower because the polyculture confuses pest insects that key in on a single crop. Researchers from the National Autonomous University of Mexico have measured these effects directly. A Chinampa, as a unit of farmland, is also a unit of climate engineering. It builds its own weather on a small scale, and that small scale is exactly the scale at which most plants live. This is part of why the productivity numbers are so high. It is not just that the soil is good, it is that the field itself is rigging the local conditions in favor of the crops. We do not have any modern farm system that does this. We have the opposite: vast monocultures that strip the local microclimate down to bare wind and bare sun. The Chinampa was a sophisticated piece of biological engineering disguised as a vegetable patch, and we tore it up to make room for cattle. Why did this system die? It did not die by accident. The Spanish, after the conquest, drained the lake. They literally drained it. Because of yearly flooding in the lower city, the colonial engineers cut canals to lower Lake Texcoco's level, exposing thousands of square kilometers of lakebed and turning it into salty alkaline scrub. The Chinampa system collapsed because the water it depended on was deliberately removed. By 1800, the lake was a fraction of its former size. By 1900, most Chinampa zones were buried under what is now Mexico City. Today, only Xochimilco survives, and even that is shrinking, choked by urban development, polluted runoff, and tourism. So when we talk about the 7 crops, we're also talking about the system that grew them. That system was scaled, distributed, low input, polycultured, and absurdly productive. It was the opposite of monoculture. And it was destroyed not by climate change or by soil exhaustion or by any natural process. It was destroyed by colonial flood control. We could rebuild it. There are pilot projects right now, run by indigenous farmers in Xochimilco and by university researchers, doing exactly that. The yields they are getting are matching the historical estimates. The system works. It always worked. We just dismantled it. And that brings us to the next crop on our list: a legume that would be the perfect candidate for any low-water farming system, including a modern Chinampa, and that today is grown almost nowhere outside a small reservation in Arizona. The Tepary bean, Phaseolus acutifolius, a bean that the Tohono O'odham, the Pima, and the broader Mexica trade network grew across what is now southern Mexico and the American Southwest for at least 5,000 years. A bean that needs roughly half the water of common beans to produce a comparable harvest. A bean that, on the data, may be the single best legume on Earth for a heating planet. And a bean you have almost certainly never eaten. Tepary plants are visually unremarkable. They look like a smaller, scruffier version of a regular kidney bean plant. The seeds come in white, brown, and mottled color, depending on the variety. What is remarkable is what the plant does under stress. Tepary beans evolved in the Sonoran Desert, one of the hottest, driest agricultural regions in the Americas. They tolerate soil temperatures of 40 degrees Celsius. They tolerate prolonged drought. They produce a meaningful crop on as little as 300 millimeters of annual rainfall, about a quarter of what common beans need. Yield analyses from the past decade, including peer-reviewed work from Colorado State, show that under high heat, low water conditions, Tepary outperforms common beans on every metric that matters: pod count, seed weight, total biomass. Nutritionally, Tepary is dense. A half cup of cooked brown Tepary beans runs about 23 grams of protein and a high fiber load. The amino acid profile is comparable to other legumes. The glycemic index is low, meaning the beans release sugar slowly and are excellent for diabetes management. The Tohono O'odham, who have one of the highest rates of type 2 diabetes in the United States, have been studied for the protective effect of traditional foods on their glucose regulation. Tepary beans figure prominently in that picture. So why is this not the world's bean? Why are we not planting Tepary across drought-stricken East Africa, across the dry regions of South Asia, across Australia? The answer is, the answer you are starting to predict. There is no industrial seed pipeline for Tepary. There is no major breeding program. Nobody has put real money into selecting commercial varieties. The seed remains almost entirely in the hands of indigenous growers, primarily the Tohono O'odham Nation, primarily through their seed-saving organization, San Xavier Co-op Farm. They have done extraordinary work keeping the genetic line alive, but it is on them. The agribusiness world has not invested. Now think about what that means in 2026. We are watching aquifers collapse. We are watching summer rains fail in regions that fed people for generations. The American Southwest is in a mega drought that, by tree ring data, is the worst in 1,200 years. India and Pakistan have just had a series of summers where common bean crops failed across major growing regions. We are losing our staple legumes to climate. And in a small reservation south of Tucson, there is a bean that thrives in exactly these conditions, that has been thriving in them for 5,000 years, that needs no irrigation, that needs no chemical fertilizer, that produces a complete protein with low glycemic load, and the global agricultural system is largely ignoring it. There is one more piece of this story, and it is uncomfortable. The Tohono O'odham, the people who carried the Tepary forward through 5,000 years and into the modern era, have, in the past 30 years, sued multiple times to protect their seed. In 1999, a private company in Colorado attempted to patent specific varieties of Tepary as proprietary cultivars, varieties that had been grown by the Tohono O'odham for centuries. The patent was eventually withdrawn after public pressure and legal action by the indigenous community, but it was a close call. The pattern, again, is the one we have seen repeatedly. The crop survives in indigenous hands. The crop becomes valuable. Outside actors try to capture the seed line through patents, contracts, or commercial cultivation. And if the indigenous community is not legally and politically organized to push back, the genetics they preserved end up enclosed under someone else's name. This is not a metaphor. It is a property law problem that is played out repeatedly across the indigenous Americas in the past 40 years. The crops survive only because someone with a lawyer is fighting for them. There is some good news. A handful of restaurants in the Southwest are featuring Tepary on their menus. Some farmers in Arizona and California are running small commercial plantings. Slow Food International has placed it on its Ark of Taste, which is a list of foods at risk of extinction. But scale? There is no scale. The bean that should be on every drought-prone field on Earth is still treated as a curiosity. That is what we are losing. And it is what we can recover fast if anyone in agribusiness decides to. That is crop 4. We are halfway through. The next one is going to sound like science fiction. It is not. The word in Nahuatl translates roughly as stone of excrement, a name that refers to its appearance, dried and cake-like, scraped from the surface of a salt lake. The thing itself is one of the most extraordinary food sources humans have ever exploited. The Mexica were eating microalgae in industrial quantities 400 years before any European had a concept of what microalgae was. The lake in question was Lake Texcoco, the same lake that hosted the Chinampa system. Texcoco was a soda lake, highly alkaline, heavily mineralized, the kind of water environment that is hostile to most life, but that supports in dense blue-green mats a cyanobacterium called Arthrospira. The modern world knows it as Spirulina. The Mexica harvested it by paddling out into the shallows, dragging sticks or fine nets through the water, and lifting the green slime onto the boats. They scraped it off, spread it on stones to dry in the sun, and pressed it into thin cakes. The cakes were sold by weight in the Tlatelolco market. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, the Spanish soldier and chronicler who walked through Tenochtitlan with Cortés, described the cakes in his account of the conquest. He wrote of fishermen and others selling little cakes made of something like slime, which they collect from that big lagoon. He found it strange. He did not understand what they were eating. He should have. Spirulina is, gram for gram, 60% protein. It carries a complete amino acid profile. It is rich in iron, in B vitamins, in beta-carotene, in essential fatty acids. NASA has flagged it repeatedly as a candidate food for long-duration spaceflight. The World Health Organization has, on multiple occasions, recommended it as a supplement for malnourished populations, particularly children. The Mexica, looking at a slime on the surface of a lake, understood something about food density that took the rest of the world 450 years to catch up to. The harvest collapsed when the lake was drained. We talked about that in the Chinampa section. Once the soda lake was reduced and freshened, the spirulina mats died. The harvest tradition died with them, and for centuries, the world's first microalgae food was forgotten. In the 1960s, French researchers studying the few remaining alkaline lakes in Central Africa rediscovered the same organism being harvested by villagers in Chad, on Lake Chad. The Kanembu people had been making something similar, called dihe. That find, combined with parallel rediscovery in Mexico, kicked off the modern spirulina industry. Today, spirulina is grown commercially in heated raceways and tanks across India, China, Mexico, the United States, and Spain. The global market is in the billions of dollars. It is sold as a green powder in health food stores and as an ingredient in everything from energy bars to pet food. But here's the important part. The Mexica harvest was free. The lake fed the city for nothing. There was no fertilizer input, no fossil fuel, no industrial heating. The biology did the work. Modern commercial spirulina, by contrast, is grown in heated tanks with added nutrients, often using groundwater, and trucked to markets thousands of kilometers away. The energy balance is fine, but it is nothing like the zero-input miracle the original system was. We took an organism that fed itself on alkaline lake water and turned it into another input-intensive industrial crop. We fixed what was not broken. There is also a parallel story from Africa that bears mentioning, because it is the rarest thing in agricultural history. An independent rediscovery of the same food in two unconnected places. In the 1960s, when French researchers were investigating sources of food for arid regions, they encountered the Kanembu people of Lake Chad in Central Africa. The Kanembu had been harvesting Arthrospira from the alkaline shallows of Lake Chad for at least several centuries. They called it dihe. They harvested it the same way the Mexica did, by skimming the surface, drying it on sand, and forming it into thin cakes. They ate it as a sauce on millet and sorghum, sometimes daily. The cakes were sold in markets across the Sahel as a high-value food item. When the French researchers tested the dried cakes, the protein and micronutrient content matched almost exactly, the analyses being done independently on revived Mexican spirulina. Two civilizations, 8,000 kilometers apart, no possible cultural contact. Both discovered the same blue-green organism. Both worked out the same drying technique. Both built it into the local food system. The mathematics of nutrient density in alkaline lakes is apparently universal, and humans, given enough time and pressure, find it. The Kanembu tradition, like the Mexica, has been disrupted by drought, by the shrinking of Lake Chad due to climate change, and by the displacement of communities by the Boko Haram insurgency. The cakes still exist. The harvest is reduced, and we lost something else. The traditional cakes, the dried, sun-cured Tecuitlatl that traveled well, kept for months and was eaten directly without any processing. Modern spirulina is almost always sold as a powder or a tablet. The cake form, the form the Mexica actually used, is gone outside of a handful of revival projects. It is one of the cleanest examples of how the recipe disappears even when the ingredient survives. We have spirulina. We do not have Tecuitlatl. The plant lives. The food, the actual food, is dead. We are 5 crops in, 2 left. The next one you will recognize. It is in your kitchen, almost certainly, in some form. But the version you have is a shadow of what existed. The tomatillo, or, in its older and more accurate name, meal tomate. The little green tomato in the papery husk. The base of every authentic green salsa. The sauce that goes on enchiladas verdes. The thing you have probably bought in a North American supermarket and assumed was just a regional variant of a tomato. It is not. The miltomate is its own genus, Physalis. It is older than the cultivated tomato by centuries. The Mexica grew dozens, possibly hundreds of varieties, ranging from small berry-sized fruits to tomatillos the size of plums, and from bright green to purple and gold. The fruit ripens inside an inflated paper husk that the plant produces around it, protecting the developing seed from insects, from wind, from drying. The taste, when ripe, is complex, sweet, slightly sour, with a vegetable note that the cultivated tomato has spent centuries breeding away. Medicinally, the Mexica used miltomate extensively. The fruit was applied to wounds. Decoctions of the plant were used for fevers, for sore throats, for digestive complaints. Modern research has confirmed that Physalis species carry compounds, withanolides in particular, with documented anti-inflammatory and antimicrobial activity. The Mexica did not have the chemistry. They had the empirical observation. They worked. What we lost is the variety, not the miltomate as a food. The modern tomatillo trade, mostly out of Mexico, and a small slice of California growers, has kept a few commercial varieties going. What we lost is the genetic diversity. The Mexica grew tomatillos suited to high altitudes, to dry climates, to wet ones, to sandy soils, to clay. They grew sweet ones for fresh eating, sour ones for sauce, fragrant ones for medicine. Most of those varieties are gone. The few that survive are held in seed banks, native seeds. Search in Tucson, the National Gene Bank of Mexico, a handful of small private collections. The commercial trade, meanwhile, runs on 3 or 4 standardized varieties, bred for shelf life and for the specific size that fits a North American grocery display. This is what monoculture does to a food. It does not always kill it outright. Sometimes it just narrows the gene pool to whatever the supply chain prefers, and the rest is allowed to die. The Mexica grew miltomate as a polyculture. Different varieties intermixed, cross-pollinating, producing seed that adapted slightly each generation to the specific microclimate of a given village. That kind of localized, adaptive agriculture is incompatible with industrial trade. So, it is gone. What you have in the supermarket as a tomatillo. What the Mexica had was 100 tomatillos. The difference is not visible at the produce counter, but it is everything. There is one historical detail about the miltomate that almost no popular source mentions, and it is striking. The Mexica used different miltomate varieties as botanical timekeepers. Specific cultivars matured at specific times relative to the rainy season. Early season ones, mid-season ones, late season ones. And the planting calendar in indigenous farming villages was structured around them. A village would know that the rains were ending because the late season tomatillos were ripening. They would know to begin planting maize because the early season tomatillos had set fruit. The plant was not just food, it was a clock. When the colonial state replaced indigenous farming calendars with the Catholic liturgical calendar, saints' days, the Easter cycle, the harvest festivals tied to European seasons, that botanical timing system collapsed. Farmers did not need to read tomatillo varieties anymore because they were being told when to plant by a priest with a missal. The varieties that mattered for timing simply stopped being selected for. They blurred together, or mixed with other lines, and within a few generations, the calendar function of the plant was lost. We still have miltomates that fruit. We do not have miltomates that tell time. That is a more precise kind of loss than just losing a vegetable. It is losing a piece of ecological literacy that took centuries to build. there is a slow recovery underway. Heritage seed-saving organizations, Native Seeds Search, Seed Savers Exchange, and a number of small Mexican growers have been quietly distributing rare miltomate varieties to home gardeners for the past 2 decades. The genetic diversity is slowly coming back, plant by plant, seed packet by seed packet. But the commercial system is still running on 3 varieties, and the miltomate is, by any reasonable measure, one of the most underutilized fruits in the modern food system. It grows easily, it produces heavily, it tolerates drought. It has a longer shelf life than a tomato because of that papery husk. There is no reason it could not be a major staple. There's no agribusiness margin in distributing 100 different versions of the same plant. That is 6. 1 left. And the 7th is the one you have all seen, growing wild on roadsides in Mexico in the southwest, and the one almost no North American eats, even though it might be, plant for plant, the most useful drought crop on earth: the nopal, the prickly pear, the flat paddle-shaped pad of the opuntia cactus, eaten as a vegetable across Mexico, Central America, and the Mediterranean since at least the time of the Mexica. The plant that grows on bare rock with no soil and no irrigation. The plant that, in 2026, ought to be a global staple, and is not. Opuntia is a genus of about 150 species of cacti, native to the Americas, with the cultivated species, primarily Opuntia ficus indica, having spread by trade across the world. The Mexica ate the pads, called nopales, and the fruit, called tunas. The pads, when the spines are scraped off and the flesh is grilled, sliced, or boiled, taste somewhere between green beans and bell pepper, with a mucilaginous texture similar to okra. The fruit is sweet, intensely so, with the sugar profile of a melon and the flesh density of a pear. The nutritional and medical profile is remarkable. Nopales are high in fiber, particularly the soluble fiberpectin, which slows blood sugar absorption and binds dietary fats. Multiple clinical studies, including peer-reviewed work in Mexico and the United States, have shown that eating nopales with a meal flattens the post-meal glucose spike. Repeatable effect that has been used clinically as a low-cost intervention for type 2 diabetes. The pads are also high in calcium, magnesium, and antioxidants. The fruit is rich in vitamin C in betalains, the same pigment family as beetroot, and in a compound called indicaxanthin that has documented neuroprotective activity. So what is Nopal doing for the global food system? Almost nothing. Outside of Mexico and a slice of the Mediterranean, Italy, Spain, North Africa, it is essentially absent. It is not in mainstream supermarkets in the United States, Canada, Northern Europe, or East Asia, except as a curiosity in ethnic food sections. There is no major commercial breeding program. There is no global trade comparable to even mid-tier vegetables like aubergine. And yet the agronomic profile is, on paper, almost perfect for a heating planet. Nopal needs essentially no irrigation in regions that get more than 200 millimeters of annual rain. It grows in soils too poor for almost any other crop. It is fire resistant. It produces in 3 to 5 years from a planted pad. It can be cropped continuously for decades from the same plant. You take pads, the plant regrows. You take more pads. It produces both vegetable and fruit on the same plant. Goats, cattle, and sheep eat the pads as forage. In the Sahel, in the Horn of Africa, in arid Australia, in the dry interior of Brazil, Nopal could be a transformative, drought-resilient crop. We know this. There are pilot programs running. None of them are at scale. There is one piece of Nopal history that is rarely told outside Mexico, and that captures the political dimension of the plant. The image on the modern Mexican flag, the eagle perched on a cactus, holding a serpent in its beak, is a nopal. The founding myth of Tenochtitlan tells that the Mexica wandered for centuries, searching for the sign their god had promised. An eagle on a prickly pear cactus, devouring a snake. They found it on an island in Lake Texcoco in the year 1325, and that is where they founded their capital. The plant is, in the most literal sense, the foundational plant of the Mexican nation. After independence in 1821, the new Mexican state placed the nopal at the center of its flag and its national identity. And yet, for most of the colonial period, and for parts of the modern period, eating nopal was associated with rural poverty, with the indio, with everything the criollo and mestizo upper classes wanted distance from. There is a long, painful sociology to this. A plant can be on a flag and on a coat of arms and at the same time be socially demoted at the dinner table. The recovery of nopal as a cosmopolitan food, eaten by educated urban Mexicans, has happened only in the last 40 years, and it is still incomplete. The plant the empire was named for took 5 centuries to be socially rehabilitated within the empire's successor state. That is how deep the colonial cultural reprogramming went. Why? Because the plant is associated in the colonial imagination with poverty. Because the modern Mexican agricultural elite, until very recently, viewed nopal as peasant food and discouraged its commercial export. Because the spines are an obstacle to mechanical harvest, although thornless varieties have been bred for over 100 years. Because the cactus does not fit neatly into existing supermarket category management. Is it a fruit? A vegetable? A salad item? Because, as with every other crop on this list, there is no one with a structural incentive to push it onto a shelf in Iowa. That is the 7th crop. That is the Codex of Suppression. Every one of them more useful than the staples that replace them on every metric that matters. Nutrition, drought tolerance, soil tolerance, productivity per acre. Every one of them either banned, drained out, monocultured down, or simply ignored. And every one of them still alive, in seed banks, in indigenous communities, in small farmers markets. We did not lose them. We just stopped using them. The Codex is closed on the 7. Now we have to look at the pattern, because once you see it once, you cannot unsee it. And it explains everything about why your food looks the way it looks. Look back across the 7. Take a step back from the individual stories and squint. You will see a pattern. It has nothing to do with any specific crop. It has to do with what kinds of crops industrial systems can accept and what kinds they cannot. Consider what the 7 have in common. Amaranth, Chia, Huauzontle, Tepary beans, Tecuitlatl, miltomate, Nopal. These are crops grown in polyculture, not monoculture. They were tended by hand. They depended on local seed saving rather than on centralized commercial seed supply. They were processed minimally, popped, dried, fermented, ground, at household scale. Their nutritional value came from variety and density, not from caloric volume. They were sold in markets where the buyer and the grower could see each other's faces. They were, in a word, illegible. Illegible to a tax inspector, illegible to a colonial administrator, eligible to a commodity exchange, eligible to a futures contract, eligible to a multinational seed company looking for proprietary varieties to license. Compare that to what replaced them: wheat, corn, soy, rice. These 4 crops now provide more than 60% of the calories eaten by human beings on Earth. All 4 are grown in monoculture. All 4 are harvested by combine. All 4 are stored in standardized silos. All 4 are traded on centralized commodity exchanges. All 4 have well-developed proprietary seed pipelines. All 4 are easily counted, easily taxed, easily collateralized, easily insured, easily speculated upon. They are legible crops. They are crops that fit a system designed to count things from a long distance away. And here is the thing: the legibility came at a cost. The protein density of wheat is lower than Amaranth's. The drought tolerance of corn is lower than Tepary's. The micronutrient density of rice is lower than Huauzontle's. The water use of soy is higher than Nopal's. The food we now eat is, in measurable nutritional terms, weaker than the food the Mexica ate. We did not trade up. We traded sideways into a system optimized not for the eater, but for the trader. The eater became, in this system, a downstream consumer of whatever the legible crop optimization produced. The grower became a contractor, growing whatever the seed company licensed and the elevator accepted. The crop, the actual plant, was selected for the convenience of everyone in the middle, and almost nobody at either end. The Spanish ban on Amaranth was the first move in this game. The Spanish needed to count tribute, and they could not count Huautli, so they killed it. Modern agribusinesses' quiet abandonment of Huauzontle is the same move. Agribusiness needs to count futures contracts, and there is no futures contract on Huauzontle, so it does not exist commercially. The mechanism is different. The colonial state used soldiers and edicts and severed hands. The modern food system uses subsidies, seed patents, and supply chain economics. But the outcome is identical. Crops that resist being counted lose. Crops that submit to being counted win. And the ones that lose regardless of how good they are for the body that eats them. There is a political scientist named James Scott who wrote a book called Seeing Like a State in 1998 that explains this pattern with a precision that is hard to improve on. Scott's argument, simplified, is that modern states need to make their populations and their economies legible, that is, countable from a distance by a clerk who has never visited the field. To do this, states impose simplifications. Family names get standardized, streets get numbered, land gets surveyed and registered, crops get reduced to a small number of standard cultivars. The simplifications are useful for the state. They allow taxation, conscription, planning, control. But they have a cost. Whatever does not fit the simplification, the indigenous family names, the unmarked alleyways, the polyculture farm with 12 crops on one plot, gets erased not because anyone hates it, but because the state cannot see it. Scott calls this process high modernism. The 7 crops are textbook examples. They were not legible. The colonial state could not see them. The modern food system, which is just the global state's stomach, also cannot see them. So they fall off the map, not killed, just rendered invisible to anyone with the power to allocate resources. This is why this is an entry in the Codex and not just a list. The point is not that there are 7 specific crops we should grow more of. The point is that there is a pattern of selection, 400 years deep, that has been deciding what is on your plate. It is not a conspiracy. There is no committee. There is just a set of structural pressures that have, again and again, picked the legible crop over the nutritious one, the storable one over the local one, the patentable one over the open pollinated one. Once you see the pattern, every shelf in the supermarket starts to look like a colonial inventory. And every gap on the shelf, every plant that is not there, starts to look like a deliberate absence. The good news is that the absence is recoverable. Seeds exist. Communities still hold the knowledge. The Chinampa works. The Tepary works. The Amaranth works. The system that suppressed them is not invincible. It just feels invincible because it has never been seriously challenged at scale. That is the next move, and it is one you can make, which is what the closing entry is about. So what do you do with this? You have just spent an hour with the Codex. You have 7 plants in your head that you did not have an hour ago. You have a pattern. You have, if the entries did their job, a small but persistent suspicion that the food in your kitchen is poorer than it has any reason to be. Now what? The first move is the smallest one. Eat one of the 7 this week. Buy amaranth flour at a health food store and stir it into your breakfast porridge. Toss chia seeds into a glass of water and drink it. If you live anywhere in the southwestern United States and Mexico, find Tepary beans at a farmer's market and cook them like any other dried bean. If you live in central Mexico, buy Huauzontle and learn the recipe. If you have access to a Latin grocery, buy nopals already cleaned and grill them. The point is not to become a Mexico revivalist. The point is to put one plant from the suppressed list back into the rotation of your week. Once you do this, you have started at the smallest scale possible. To undo a 400-year erasure, the second move is to grow one. Amaranth is one of the easiest plants in the world to grow. It tolerates almost any soil. It self-seeds. It is decorative. If you have a square meter of garden, a balcony with a planter, anything, you can grow it. Tepary beans grow well in dry summers. Huauzontle grows like its weedy relatives. Nopal pads planted directly into soil root within months. The seeds are available. Native seeds. Search in Tucson sells them by mail. Seed Savers Exchange sells them. Small Mexican seed companies sell them online. The barrier to entry is almost zero. Within one growing season, you can have plants in the ground that the Spanish Empire spent decades trying to extinguish. The third move is the largest. Tell someone. The reason these crops were lost is the reason most things are lost. They fell out of the conversation. People stopped talking about them. Their names left the language. Their flavors left the kitchens. The chain of transmission broke. You can put a link back into the chain just by mentioning Huauzontle in a conversation, by handing someone a packet of amaranth seed, by cooking nopals for a friend who has never had them. None of this is heroic. It is the kind of slow, household-scale recovery that built these crops in the first place, 1,500 years before Cortez. What we can learn from this today in one sentence is the thing every entry in this codex has been pointing at. The food on your plate is the residue of choices that other people made for other reasons, mostly without your knowledge and mostly without your consent. You do not have to accept those choices. You can choose differently. The seeds are still there. The methods are still there. The communities are still there. The system that buried them is, like every system, only as strong as its grip on what people actually do with their hands and their kitchens and their tongues. Loosen that grip a little in your own life, and the whole structure starts to look smaller than it was when you began. That is the 7th entry on the 7 crops. The codex is closed for now. There are more entries coming. There are always more entries coming. Until then, plant something, cook something, pass something on. The work of unforgetting is not done by historians. It is done by anyone who picks up a seed and refuses to let it disappear.